So two great talks and a great commentator to follow. Carlota McAllister is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at York University. Her monograph, The Good Road, Conscience and Consciousness in a Post-Revolutionary Mayan Village in Guatemala, is forthcoming with Duke University Press. If you want to buy it, there's a discount online. No, I just made that up. Her current project addresses a dam conflict in the remote Aysén region of Chilean Patagonia. So now I invite Carlota to comment on the two papers that you just heard.
These papers are organized around different concepts. So Alejandro's is dealing with the secret, I think is kind of the core concept in your paper, whereas Megan's is about mobility. But I think despite this difference and the ways that that might make them seem like they're not speaking to each other, they share a number of attributes. For one thing, they're much more explicitly engaged with questions of the law than with questions of what we might call religion or the divine, which is what we've sort of been talking about, the domains that we've been talking about up until now. And of course, part of what we learned in the first session is that it's important to decenter the law as the site of power. So that was a big contribution. But the law, of course, despite even as we decenter it in our accounts of how power is exercised and of the state, nonetheless, we must recognize that the law remains a significant tool of power and a significant site where power is exercised. And I think these papers, what they do is help us think about how the law might become important or be seen as important within a framework that includes theopolitics as well as political theology. So that's my proposal here. Both papers describe political projects in which a past that predates the contemporary nation state is evoked to legitimize a transgression of the boundaries of the nation state and the territorializations that are affected in the name of those boundaries. Both mark the significance of that past by calling it sacred. I think in both instances that word was actually used, which is a different word than some of the other ones that we've been talking about, religious, et cetera, and maybe belongs to a different theoretical vocabulary. The glaringly big difference that I see between your two papers is that Megan's paper is about a project that resists the settler state, whereas Alejandro's is about a project that is seeking to extend the settler state. So that's interesting. And of course, both of these projects are drawing on different traditions, different religious traditions, if we want to call them that, for understanding the relationship between the state and what might be said to exceed it, whatever you want to call that. But given these differences, they tell, actually, I think, remarkably similar stories about the work that mobilizing the law does for laying claim to the sacred and the political practices that are legitimized in the name of the sacred. So the sacred, for anthropologists, of course, is something we would associate with Durkheim and other people as well. And sacralization, according to Durkheimians Hubert and Moos, demands symbolic movement from the profane to the sacred and back again, usually through a rite of passage that involves sacrifice. So we've all read this stuff. In both of these ethnographies, I think what is interesting is that we have people engaged in very literal but also ceremonialized movement across contested land. So this isn't just symbolic, it's actually, they're moving, people are moving around. In Megan's, of course, the Nishi walkers move this extraordinary distance, crossing provincial and municipal boundaries, as well as those of different mappings of land rights, both state-centered land rights and Aboriginal land rights, restating with their movements a pluriversal ontology of place as respect for multi-species relationships and those who are able to engage in them properly. So this is this instantiation that happens through this movement, which is called sacred by the people that are engaged in it. In Alejandro's, what struck me was the image of David Barry's covert 1980s walks through Silwan. This is very creepy, right? Gathering the intelligence on the built environment that he will then deploy as a kind of proleptic agent of the Israeli state. And shaping the paths, of course, that then subsequent school tours will follow as they move through Silwan. If I'm hearing you right, and follow through this imaginatively reclaimed and yet also concealed city of David, right? So these walking is part of creating this secret that is also public and so on and so forth. In both cases, the law has to be mobilized to be sacralized. and also needs to be sacralized to give it the power to instantiate these new configurations of territory. But, okay, having gone through this Durkheimian thing, too much emphasis on the theoretical vocabulary of the sacred and the similarities it reveals between these two papers perhaps imposes a false equivalence, I would argue, on the projects they describe. And these projects are not equivalent for a lot of reasons. For one thing, if sacralization demands a sacrifice, as it does in Ubel and most, it's easy to figure out who the sacrifice is in Alejandro's paper, which is the Palestinian residents of Silwan. But we may be more challenged to find a sacrifice in Megan's. I'm not sure who or what is being sacrificed there in the same sense. And that pushes, I think, a question, which is who is pushing this vocabulary of the sacred anyways? Where does this vocabulary come from? I really loved your discussion, Alejandro, of this notion of the public secret, of the state's reliance on something that vibrates with a sacred light, these words, just out of our ability to glimpse it. And despite your demurrals, of course, this discussion has deep theological resonances, and we can think of the work of Frank Cody and Joel Robbins and all these things about the secret and the sense of an ending and the ways that this compels us and pulls us forward in particular direction. And I loved the discussion of the tell. And I wondered, is that where when we talk about like the tell in poker, is this where this comes from? I don't know. Anyways, it's an interesting, a tell in poker is when you reveal without meaning to what your hand is actually holding, right? So this idea of the tell and this space as the tell, which I hadn't heard before. I love that idea. Perhaps the sacred and its call to act in relation to a particular eschatology, which we might think of as Judeo-Christian or just straight up Christian, perhaps, is also part of the politics of recognition. Is this what we mean where the word politics is invoked to delegitimize Palestinian complaints about serving as a sacrifice, to reframe them as mere interruptions to excellent neighborly relations, which is another great quote from your fieldwork? Is that what happens? Is that how we demarcate these domains in a way that allows us to not recognize the sacrifice, to keep the sacrifice secret, and yet use its power to legitimate your project, et cetera, et cetera? And if that's the case, if it is part of the politics of recognition, even though the Nishiyu walkers invoke this language, and of course it's always difficult to get outside of the politics of recognition, you have to work hard at it, and I think that's what they're describing. Are they also trying to gesture towards other paths of legitimacy than one that moves only between the predefined domains of the profane and that which might be understood to transcend it?